Hi, good evening, folks. We're going to let folks load into the virtual room, and then we'll get started in a few moments with Dr. Kornberg and Marci Harris. Thanks for being here. Yeah, virtual numbers ticking up. We love to see it. Okay, we'll give it just a couple more minutes. Let folks, remember that it's 7:30 and stop eating their dinner or walk their dinner over to their computer or whatever logistical thing they're doing and get started in earnest. Okay, we'll get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jackie from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're super thrilled to host tonight's event with Marci Kornberg, presenting her new book, Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process. She will be talking with Marci Harris, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Marci, and the team at Columbia University Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar this evening, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other tonight throughout the event, which we highly encourage. The first is in the chat, which you can find by clicking on a little button that looks like a chat box, like a discussion box. We invite you to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to fellow attendees. And I just put a link into the chat so that you can also, it'll pop up and turn red so that you know where your chat box is if you could not find it on your screen before. The other option is if you have more specific questions you'd like to have answered by the author, you can please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two dialoguing speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A this evening to be answered later on in the part of the program. So if there's something particularly awesome they're saying during the discussion part, put your Q&A in and it'll be there when we get to that part of the evening. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Inside Congressional Committees, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we are offering a 10% off the featured book. The code is in the event link that I just handed to you in the chat. And it'll let you check out online for an additional 10% off for being here tonight. So a little bit about our discussion. Our interviewer tonight is Marci Harris. Marci is a co-founder and the CEO of PopVox Inc. and the executive director of the PopVox Foundation, organizations with the mission to inform and empower people and make government work better for everyone. She was a fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democracy in 2016, a New America Fellow in 2017, and is an affiliated scholar with the Citrus Policy Lab at UC Berkeley, as well as teaching at San Jose State University and the University of San Francisco's School of Public Administration. She will be speaking this evening with our featured author, Dr. Marci Kornberg. Marci leads research for the Elections and Government program at the NYU Brennan Center for Justice. She also teaches political science at NYU and has previously taught at Georgetown and American universities. She's worked on democratic governance issues at nonprofits, international development organizations, and think tanks, including leading an international project for the UNDP and Interparliamentary Union about parliamentary civic engagement during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she is a local to Brooklyn, like we are in Greenlight, and we're delighted to have her with us for this evening's discussion. A little about the book. So it is widely believed that Congress has broken down. Media accounts present the storied legislature as thoroughly gridlocked, immobilized by partisan rancor, and political scientists find that Congress is passing fewer laws and spending less time on legislative work. Which parts of the supposedly dysfunctional legislature continue to function? Through a comprehensive exploration of whom committees hear from and how they listen. Maya Kornberg's new book, Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process, demonstrates that Congress is not as dysfunctional as is often claimed. So a nice hopeful message there. Maya is going to start us off with the reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Marci and with all of you. So without further ado, please take it away, Maya. And everyone, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Jackie, and thank you, Greenlight, for having me. I'm really delighted to be here with you all and talk about one of my favorite topics, congressional committees. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from the book. It's an adapted excerpt, and then look forward to the discussion. The 118th Congress opened with a rocky start. The new rules package adopted as part of the negotiations over electing a speaker highlighted the many procedural issues that hamper the contemporary legislative process. So what will it take for Congress to get its work done? My new book aims to answer this question, looking under the legislative hood and exploring committees as the concourse leading up to bill passage. The analysis draws on an original data set of 1,364 pieces of witness testimony, representing 456 hearings over across 8 congressional committees during the 112th to the 116th Congress, as well as 65 interviews with senators, representatives, staff members, witnesses, and others. The book shows that when you zoom out and explore the legislative process as a whole, instead of just the vote counts, Congress appears full of working parts. Although it is greatly hampered by procedural, partisan, and other constraints, parts of the committee process still work some of the time. So when the culture of the committee and the working relationships between the majority and the minority staff remain collegial, or the topics are bipartisan, hearings can be more likely to be used as deliberative forums, educational platforms, and spaces for personal connection between members. Senate committees may also have greater propensity than House committees for deliberation, personal connection, and learning because of the structural and cultural differences. Educational hearings may be more likely in instances in which there is no imminent legislation. So the information and the witnesses shared are more likely to be new. One member of the House Science Committee told me in an interview, if you're talking about the far future, you can act in a much more bipartisan way. When you're talking about next year's budget or tribal issues like climate change, you immediately go into parties. Television cameras promote theatricality and superficiality, whereas informal settings elicit greater learning and personal connection. As a result, an external observer might understandably overestimate the number of theatrical hearings. They're the ones that are reported on, whereas low-profile hearings, by nature, are less likely to garner media attention. Committee hearings also still serve as spaces to hear a range of public views. The witness testimony shared in committee hearings is diverse, analytical, and informative, and it draws on the professional expertise, opinions, and personal experiences of many Americans. Certain types of witnesses affect committee members in distinct ways. So witnesses untarnished by political labels stemming from their affiliations, like progressive or conservative, are more likely to inspire open listening and inquisitive questioning on the part of members. And exposure to different views in hearings may also lead to legitimization and collaboration that is necessary to overcome partisan gridlock. So this book does not argue that Democrats hearing Republicans will change their minds immediately, but it does tell stories of how understanding the other side's arguments and priorities has revealed new areas for collaboration between members. For example, a staffer for a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee explained to me how, as a result of attending a hearing about the existence of a position supporting women's issues in the State Department, her boss was able to see which members cared about the issue, allowing her to work with them to protect this position. In some instances, this leads to legitimization of other viewpoints. As the congressman in the introduction to this book related, when you zoom in and take a close look at the stories that shape the senators and representatives and their work, a complex tapestry of relationships, informal norms, and hopeful stories of learning and legislating emerges. This does not mean that Congress today is not broken, impotent, or embroiled in conflict. It is. But it is possible to have a more accurate and more nuanced pictures, which the interviews and analysis in the book provide. And with an understanding of what works and what can be improved, Congress can continue to strengthen itself as a proxy for the American people, properly fit to tackle present-day problems. Throughout the book, I make recommendations to bolster the committee system. Bipartisan agenda setting meetings and active promotion of non-legislative hearings can increase the number of educational and deliberative hearings. Professional advisory boards not beholden to chairs would strengthen the quality of information and the information processing in committees, as would hiring professional policy staffers with adequate pay. Along the same lines, the newly minted Congressional Office for Diversity and Inclusion can go a long way in creating a more diverse group of committee staffers that can create more representative witness panels. And more video hearings in Congress would yield similar benefits. Implementing these and other reforms can ensure that committee hearings make full use of their modern potential. So that's an excerpt from the book. And I'm excited to now talk about it a little bit more with my colleague, Marci.
Thank you so much, Maya. My nerd heart sings at the mention of the function and dysfunction of the Congressional Committee system, which is your subtitle. Congratulations on the book. And I would say also welcome to all of the students. I think we've got a few on, both of us here. So for those who are not absolutely entrenched in the congressional ecosystem, let's just step back for a minute. You said we've just started the 118th Congress. Can you say a little bit about what that means and how many committees there are, and also just maybe lay the groundwork for talking a bit about who you spoke to for this book? Because looking at the list of interviews and people that you actually were able to bring together, it's really, I think, a pretty big deal in the political science literature that you spoke to so many people who are actually on the ground doing this work.
Thanks. So as you said, I was lucky enough to speak to a lot of people in Congress in order to learn from them about how they're doing their jobs and how we can strengthen Congress. So I spoke to 65 interviewees overall, and that included sitting members of the House of Representatives as well as the Senate, committee staff, and I made a point of talking to both majority and minority committee staff, personal staff who have a kind of a different job. They staff the offices themselves, the offices of the members themselves, rather than a specific committee. And I also spoke to other relevant stakeholders who are key to the process of how we put together hearings, witnesses who've come to testify, lobbyists who I talk about in the book infiltrate every part of this process. So really trying to tell a comprehensive story of how the process works. I made a point of trying to get a sample that was representative, a sample that included both Republicans and Democrats on every committee that I looked at, a sample that included a demographic representation of members with different lived experience and staff with different lived experience, and staff of different seniority levels as well. So really to try to, all in all, piece together this super complex picture that we see today. And that brings me to the other part of your question, which is the 118th Congress. I think this is a really exciting time to be discussing this, because, and not just for me because I'm a political science nerd, but also in terms of the climate. Congress has been in the news a lot lately for its dysfunction. We all know that the speaker had a very dramatic election and leads a divided party. And what this means, I think, is that there's a lot of space for committees to come in and take some of this power. And we could talk a little bit more about that as well. But there's a real shift in the dynamic in Congress right now. This drama also means that there could be changes in the kind of congressional processes and procedures that I talk about in the book. And the other exciting thing going on in Congress right now is that Congress itself is looking at these same problems that I am talking about. So in 2019, they started a select committee in the House called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. that introspected and looked at ways Congress can strengthen itself. And Marci and others have testified before the committee as it tried to learn about how it can do its job better. And now this committee is a permanent subcommittee on the House Administration Committee, which allows for even more space for Congress to be looking at ways to improve itself. So I think it's an exciting Congress ahead.
Absolutely. We love the ModCom. And it's so interesting that so now this new subcommittee has equal number Democrats and Republicans kind of continuing the practice of the select committee. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that continues in the House. But as you said, the 118th, there's a huge emphasis from some of the negotiations that led up to that speaker vote, and part of the demands of those who were holding up their votes was a return to regular order. And some people would say that a return to regular order means more power devolved to the committees and giving rank and file members more power. How do you see that playing out? Do you think we're going to get there? Do you think committee chairs, committee members are going to have more power in this Congress than, say, the last several?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question. In the opening of the book, I opened by telling the story of how committees have changed over the past century, really. And what you see when you zoom out historically is that there's an inverse relationship. The more powerful the speaker and the party leadership in general, the less powerful the committees, and vice versa. And I'm a comparativist, so I can also put this in international perspective, and this is true really internationally. Committees and parties are competing organizing structures within legislatures. So they are inversely correlated in terms of their power. And what we've seen over the past several decades is speakers that we all know of, like Newt Gingrich, really usurping control. And now we see that could change. So right now, after speakers like Newt Gingrich and a lot of changes that I get into in the book over the past several decades, there's a breakdown of what you mentioned of regular order. Rather than the traditional process, the schoolhouse rock version that we might know, where bills are introduced and then they're referred to a committee and the committee holds hearings and it marks up the bill and it sends it back to the floor. Increasingly, what we've seen over the past several decades is the speaker and perhaps a select group of lobbyists writing legislation, pushing it down very quickly with very little time for members to hold hearings, let alone even read the bill sometimes, and then pushing it straight to a vote. So that's the system that we see increasingly today. And as you mentioned, the concessions package that Kevin McCarthy agreed to and the current climate means that could change. So one of the concessions he agreed to was to, and again, this may or may not actually pan out, but at least on paper, agreed to give members 72 hours to read bills. Another thing that has happened is that we see a lot of new committee chairs and new committee chairs who are relatively inexperienced in Congress. And we have a speaker who's facing the motion to vacate. And that means that he's under constant threat. So he may not have that same power to push bills through really quickly without soliciting input from committees, without soliciting input from individual members. So I think that on an institutional level, that might make space for more members to be involved. We may agree or disagree with the specific members and the chairs that are in power right now, but on an institutional level, we might see a devolution of power in a way that is different from what we've seen in past Congresses.
It's so interesting that you say that about the new committee chairs, because I was going to ask you about one of the parts in your book where you explain that stronger committees and more independent committees have actually meant more of a focus in the committees on expertise. But then kind of conversely, we see that we may have more independent committees now, but we also have new committee chairs and probably turnover in staff, meaning that there isn't that long institutional memory, which is something that you also talk about in the book. So can you say just a little bit about how expertise is centered in committees and how that even is intertwined with some of the staff issues you were bringing up earlier?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you mentioned, kind of the two core parts of a strong committee, and one of them is the committee leadership and the other one is the committee staff. So committee leadership, and that is the chair and the ranking member, set the tone for a committee in a number of ways. First of all, one of the things that I show in the book by analyzing all of these hearings is that the relationship between the chair and the ranking member and their ideological positioning on issues can really affect the way in which hearing panels are put together. Now, that might not be surprising, but what that means is that on committees and in hearings that are more bipartisan, you can have witness panels that make a lot more space for deliberation, where there's a lot more variety in the kinds of voices that are heard by the committee. And that's really what committees are meant to do. They're meant to deliberate. They're meant to reason through by listening to all these different perspectives. And what we see is that that is more likely, and that's still happening in committees where there's a good relationship between the chair and the ranking member, and on topics that are not yet colored by partisanship, and when there's more space for still open exploration of a topic. So not topics like climate change or nominations hearings for Brett Kavanaugh, but yes, topics like, an emerging area of science that Congress wants to understand, or a general area about farming that it wants to hear from people about. So those are areas where there's still a lot of space. And the other thing that is really crucial is staffing. I spoke to a lot of staff in the book, and the book really celebrates staff as the backbone of the way that Congress functions. And yet, staff today are just not, and Congress doesn't have enough of them to do its job. It has several thousand fewer staff today than it did a few decades ago, which is pretty shocking given the complexity of the issues that it has to handle. And in addition, staff are frequently lacking the expertise that they need. And this has nothing to do with the quality of the staff. It's just the expertise and the experience that they need. So one of the interviews that I found most interesting in the book was an interview that I did with an antitrust expert who was seconded from the Department of Justice to the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. And what he said is he came in, he had all of the specialized expertise, and that was quite rare. The average staffer in Congress today is in their mid-20s, and they've only been in their job for a handful of years. So when he came in, he said lobbyists didn't know how to handle him because he actually knew what he was talking about. And this really strengthened the process, and the committee as a whole was exposed to a lot less manipulation as a result of the fact that he could hold his own, and also benefited from his real substantive expertise in these specialized issues. So the fact that Congress does not have specialized staff like this, that's an isolated case, means that it is much more exposed to lobbyists coming in, and indeed sometimes even reliant on lobbyists for information that it just doesn't have internally and it needs to seek out elsewhere. And it doesn't have the information it needs to legislate on specialized issues. And the other issue that I talk about in the book with staffing is that staff are overwhelmingly white, and they are many times from affluent backgrounds as a result of the pipeline for hiring, which starts out with unpaid internships. About half of staffers started out as unpaid interns. And this really matters then when it comes to who's staffing Congress. About 2/3 of senior staff positions are occupied by men. And so really we don't have a representative group of senior staffers. And this also matters because staffers are the ones who are, again, seeking out information for committees, putting together witness panels, writing legislation, really doing a lot of the hard work of Congress. And so when they're not representatives of the country as a whole, then we're less likely to be hearing from the spectrum of voices in committees that we really need to be in order to have a specialized and deliberative process.
Such an important point. And I would just flag, I know that you use a lot of the research from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies in the book. I think there's a new report out actually today or yesterday on the diversity of new staffers in the 118th Congress, and there's still a long way to go there. But also, one bright spot would be that the programs for paid interns have increased over the past several years. Again, that was part of the recommendations of the Select Committee on Modernization. So little by little, steps are being taken, but such a long way to go. as you were talking about the deep expertise of members and staff, and also the influence of lobbyists, I was thinking a lot about the different approach that the parties take to committee assignments. So I love the quote that I can't remember who you were quoting, who was talking about how the committees themselves are almost like the houses of Hogwarts. That you kind of, when you get your committee is assigned at the beginning of your congressional career, it kind of sets you on a path, and those are your colleagues, and that's your focus. And also, that's where you begin to build seniority, and the parties approach that differently. So in the Republican conference, for example, there are term limits for chairs on their committees, and in the Democratic caucus, they go by seniority. So you have members who may serve for longer in the positions at the top of the committees. How does that impact things, both the selection of committees, but then also the different approaches to longevity and seniority?
And I love the Hogwarts example as well, not just because of the selection process, but also because it's a little bit like that sorting hat in Hogwarts, where there's not a lot of clarity as to how it's making its decisions. I think that the process for committee selection is similarly opaque. And there's a lot of factors that go into why people are on different committees. And there's been a lot of research on this. And of course, some of them are pretty clear, like fundraising and party unity might help you get on a certain committee. But some of it is less transparent. The way in which committees membership is assigned is through what's called steering committees. Each party has a steering committee, and those steering committees, again, through a relatively opaque process, decide who sits on which committee, and that's a big thing that we heard about in the news recently. Which committee was George Santos assigned to? How is that a sign, which it is, of his relative disempowerment within the chamber? So committees are also really a sign, a marker of power within the chamber, who gets on which committee. And then similarly, these steering committees also decide committee leadership. And so what we have is a process where there's a lot of change in new Congresses potentially. But as you mentioned, the Republican Party has term limits for chairs, and this really matters also for the staffing issue that I just mentioned. So the chairs are really central to the committee process. They get to decide what hearings there are. They get to decide the agenda, and they also hire and fire staff. And so when you have a new chair coming in, they don't all fire all of the old staff, but there's obviously a chance that they will, and they would like to bring in their new staff of their own, and that's understandable. But when you have new staff coming in, you lose a lot of the organizational memory of the committee, and a lot of that staff expertise that I just mentioned that is so important to getting things done. And the other thing that you lose are the relationships. So one of the things that I talk about in the opening of the book, when we talk about how hearings are set up, is the way in which informal norms trump formal rules in terms of the way that committees actually work. So there's the formal rules. The minority is entitled to one witness in a hearing. The minority is entitled to a kind of minimum notice of a hearing. But then there's the informal norms. Frequently, what we see in Congress today is that when the staff have good relationships with each other, the minority and the majority staff, they might even decide on a witness list together, especially for issues that are less partisan hearings. They might give the minority more time to prepare for the hearing and tell them that it's happening before the minimum notice. And so that's a real difference, but you need time in order to build those relationships. And so there are committees where I've spoken to staffers who've been there for a long time, and they just alternate majority minority depending on who's in power. And they have those long-standing relationships that really are so key to the committee culture. But when you have turnover of staff, which is again not inevitable, but more likely when there's new chairs, then that really, I think, eats away at some of this really core infrastructure of staff relationships.
It's so important. I can tell you, as someone with experience working with the Ways and Means Committee, where that, that staff is institutional. It really is. I mean, that is where the knowledge is held. I love that you dig into what goes into planning hearings. And I think there's actually a line where you talk about how unsystemic it is. And I think it's really important that probably a lot of folks watching from the outside think that there's a really formal process that somebody, that committees go through when they're planning a hearing or selecting witnesses or setting the schedule for what they're going to hold a hearing about, or even the purposes behind it. And it's just not that. And sometimes it's chaos, and sometimes it's very reactive, and often, as you really go into, witnesses are pulled from the pool of people that the staffers and members are familiar with, they've been talking to, that they know what they're going to say when they come. And that in itself really limits the universe of who Congress is hearing from. So kind of along the lines of the diversity of staff that we were talking about, the diversity of witnesses is still I think it's a remarkable thing, and it's also very difficult to measure. I would love to even hear more about how you looked into that, because that's not data that is collected or shared in any kind of consistent way. So would you talk a little bit about the hearing planning process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you're saying, it's not really as systematic as folks might think that it is. Again, there are formal rules. The reality of Congress is a lot messier than that. And that's something that I highlight throughout the book, that Congress is really a living, breathing institution, and it's shaped by all the people inside of it. And it changes and it ebbs and flows. And the reality of how things happen is a lot more malleable than the rules that are written down. But in the context of setting up a hearing and of who the witnesses are, so I got at that question in a number of different ways. I wanted to first understand where they came from professionally, their professional sector. So one of the things that I present in the book is just the professional sectors of the witnesses and how that varies by committee. And the other thing I was interested in is what language they use. So I used text analysis software to look at all these hearings and get at what language witnesses are using when addressing Congress. And what I found was a number of things, but I might highlight that there was a huge variation between sectors in the way that witnesses are addressing Congress. And so what I talk about is the tendency for what I call cautious scientists. So people coming from academia, and I have an academic background myself, so I can speak to this in social sciences as well, are not trained to be speaking in a confident way to Congress. They are much more likely to be using tentative language. They are much more likely to be leading with questions and not with conclusions. And as a result, when I spoke to members, that just really isn't something that they can hear. And that's part of the problem that Congress has in understanding science topics. Scientists come in, they speak with tentative language, they use a lot of jargon. And as a result of that, there's just not as much reception to hearing it. On the flip side, witnesses coming in from military backgrounds, from the private sector, from sectors where there's a culture of communication that really teaches people to speak with confident language, that really alters the way in which they are heard. So part of the story of diversity of witnesses and the way in which that matters is also the story of their professional background. The other thing that I talk about in the book are the kinds of witnesses that Congress might choose to hear from. So in setting up a hearing, as I mentioned, there's a lot of variation depending on the hearing topic, on the relationships, and that might alter the kind of witnesses that Congress wants to hear from. So in the book, I present a typology, the different types of witnesses. There's what I called labeled experts. If it's a partisan hearing and you want someone to just come in and make a point with the most zeal possible, many times you're going to go to the same culprits, folks who people know, folks who've written about a topic, well-known climate change skeptics, things like that. Whereas when you're dealing with a topic and you want to maintain that openness to listen, it really helps to bring in what I call an unlabeled expert, someone who's not yet tarnished by having spoken on a contentious issue or being associated with a previous administration. So there's more openness to listen. And then there's also what I call personal storytellers. So Congress hears from Americans, ordinary Americans who are coming to share their lived experience of an issue. And that's another kind of witness that can come to testify. And of course, leads to a different kind of hearing. Interestingly, I ended every single interview that I conducted with a member by asking them, tell me a story of a witness that sticks out at you, a witness that that has stuck with you. And every single one of them told me a story of what I would call a personal storyteller witness. The WNBA star who grew up on food stamps, the journalist who lived with ISIS, the mother of a sex trafficking victim. These are the witnesses who stuck with them. And this just speaks to the tremendous power of witnesses coming in who share their personal experiences. So there's a lot of different ways in which the witness panels vary, not just demographically, but also in terms of the professional sector, in terms of what they're there to actually do, and the kinds of stories that they tell. And what I break down is what kind of hearing is going to lead to what kinds of witnesses. And then, as I mentioned, how is that going to affect the way in which members are really listening? And the other thing, as you mentioned, is this tendency towards a witness pool that is just the personal networks of the staff, and in some cases, the parochial interests of the chair and the ranking member. And what we also see as a result of that is a tendency towards witnesses who might either have lobbyists paying for them to travel or be in the Washington, D.C. area, or in some other way be able to get to D.C., because Congress does not pay for witnesses to come, travel, and testify. We had Zoom hearings, and that has changed that dynamic a little bit in the COVID era. But traditionally, that's also something that in a huge country like the United States also really biases the pool of voices that Congress can hear from.
Absolutely. And I mean, as you mentioned, during COVID, the rules were changed temporarily to allow both members to participate remotely, but also to have remote witness testimony. And that has been changed. So that is no longer allowed. Government witnesses cannot in any circumstances testify remotely. Witnesses can testify remotely if they say that there's a hardship and get approval from the majority leader. That's in the Senate, or excuse me, in the House. The Senate, I'm not quite sure, they may still allow it. So in a way that felt like a little bit of a couple steps forward, then a couple steps back in terms of accessibility and just lowering barriers to participation in this conversation. And I was complaining to a GOP staffer about this, and they actually said to me, well, our approach is going to be bringing Congress to the people instead of bringing the people to Congress. And so there is a new focus on field hearings in the new Congress this year. So I wonder if you might say a little bit about what we can expect. I mean, we haven't had a focus on field hearings in ages. I mean, that was one of those things on the list of modernization suggestions that might make things work better if members had to travel together to the middle of the country and hear from real people and actually, mind their manners in front of real Americans. So how do you think it's going? We've had a few, and what do you think the best case scenario could be for a new focus on field hearings?
Yeah, I'm really excited about field hearings, and it's something that I talk about in the book. One of the stories I tell is the story of the 2018 Farm Bill. And ahead of this Farm Bill, the Agriculture Committee went on a listening tour across the country. This was very different from what we know of as the kind of traditional hearings in the hearing rooms with the portraits on the walls and the cameras and the theatricality. The committee just went out across the country and held really what can best be described as open mic sessions with farmers and local community members who could just come and share their stories and share their perspectives on this extremely complicated bill. And so this is something that really broadens the spectrum of voices that Congress can hear from and gets at exactly this point that I was talking about with the witness pools. And it also provides an opportunity, as you were mentioning, for members to travel together and form these experiences together. And that's so important for committees to do. Another story that I tell in the book is the famous friendship between Dick Lugar and Barack Obama. I interviewed Dick Lugar before his passing in 2019, and he credited their joint membership on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and specifically the trips that they took together on that committee with forming that friendship. They went on trips together to Russia and to other places, and they were really able to form a relationship outside of the rancor of Congress. And as a result of that, they maintained not just a friendship, but a fruitful working relationship until Dick Lugar's passing in 2019. And that's rare today, as we know all too well, but it's also important, and it's something that field hearings and shared experiences outside of Congress really have the potential to do. So I think that's a really exciting innovation, and something that gets at the size of the United States, the diversity of voices that Congress needs to hear, and the kinds of experiences that members need to have. And I'd add that your platform, the PopVox platform, and the way it's been used in the Environmental Justice for All Act, in the Puerto Rico Status Act, is a similar tool that perhaps not in a face-to-face way, but in an online way, also broadens the spectrum of voices. So I think there's a lot of exciting innovations going on that get at this really core problem that Congress has. It needs to hear more voices than it is right now, and it needs to be playing around with the way that it does things in order to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And you know, Natural Resources did combine the online platform with in-person meetings. So I think there was a little bit of that, but I agree. I'm really excited to see how this goes this year. But you mentioned, so we're talking about the benefits potentially of the field hearings and members getting together, which of course is the attempt to be an antidote to what is rampant partisanship, and what we normally see when when I assign students to tune into a congressional hearing. I know that they're about to go see a pie fight in many cases. So and you describe these as the theatrical type of hearing. So could you say a little bit about the 4 types of hearings that you describe in the book, and then also how partisanship has influenced the interactions of the members in committees?
Yeah, so I talk about the different kinds of hearings that Congress can have. And this is really based on what legislative scholarship has told us are the 4 key functions of committees. So committees can hold hearings in order to deliberate. That is, in order to reason through the different aspects of a policy issue and hear from different perspectives. And that's obviously key to policy formulation. Committee hearings can act as an educational platform. So committees are frequently where technical information and expertise and research is brought in to the conversation and shared by experts. And committees are also then, as you mentioned, a theatrical and a public forum. One of their key functions is really to make public things that normally happen behind closed doors. That's the way that a staffer put it to me. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. A lot of what Congress does, we don't see, but committees are one way in which what they do is made public. And so as a result, committees are also a space for members to clip different snippets of what they're saying and have sound bites and mobilize public support for issues. That's what we know them as, because that's what's on TV, but that's not the only thing that they do, but that is one of the functions. And finally, they can form a space for this kind of personal connection that I talk about. And so one of the things that the book does is to explain for each one of these functions, each one of these different kinds of hearings, when can that be most likely in Congress today? And how can we harness this knowledge in order to make committees function more effectively and be even more of a space for learning and deliberation and connection. But in regards to the theatricality point, I might point out, and I talk about this in the chapter on theatrical hearings, that I think that there's a tendency, and I talked about this in the excerpt as well, to overestimate how many theatrical hearings there are, because of course, there is a natural tendency to put on a show when there's an audience. And so all of the hearings that we might be more likely to watch on TV are exactly those hearings where members are going to be more likely to be acting theatrically. And the media also tends towards what's most salacious already. And so as a result of that, we might be overestimating, I think, as a public, how many theatrical hearings there are. But of course, there are these theatrical hearings, what we know of as the kind of the January 6th, I think, is complicated, but I might say more squarely, and I talk about this in the book, some of the nominations hearings that we've seen recently, and I talk about the Brett Kavanaugh nominations hearings in the book, climate change hearings, hearings about the Iran nuclear agreement. All these highly contentious public issues led to really theatrical hearings and opportunities for members to be mobilizing public support, to be making their views known on an issue, and to be more public facing in their work. So I think that that these hearings do exist, but they're not the only hearings, and that we can learn from when they happen in thinking through the impact that cameras have had on Congress. And I might just end by noting that cameras have not always been there. They were introduced in the 1980s. And one of the things that the book talks about is the way in which they have reshaped the way in which committees work. And so cameras are there, they encourage theatricality. And I think that there's different ways to think about how we might address that issue. And I'll leave it there because I know that we want to spend some time with Q&A.
Yeah, well, and it's such a good point that the theatrical hearings are not the only ones. I sometimes tell people that being a congressional staffer is like staying in college because you're just constantly learning. And half the time these hearings really are that, a discussion opportunity to hear from amazing witnesses that are sharing their research, their knowledge, and their experience. There's a great question from an attendee about how you would set up a committee dedicated to studying AI, and I would put even just emerging technologies in there. And it kind of ties into what I wanted to ask you about, you know, if you were in the position of being a new committee chair here in the 118th Congress, and let's build on the question and say, and your jurisdiction was emerging technologies, how would you do things differently? Which of your suggestions, or those of ModCom or others, how could you see a committee operating in a way that did prioritize expertise, that was productive, that built these relationships and got something done in this 118th Congress?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would first of all say that we need a committee on tech issues. The last time that committees were reorganized in terms of their jurisdictions of the standing committees was in the 1970s, before the internet existed. And as a result, we don't have one committee whose sole focus is tech. We have, in the Mark Zuckerberg hearings, for example, half the Senate in attendance. And what anyone who's been in any organization knows is that when everyone's in charge of something, no one is in charge of something. So committees, as I mentioned at the outset, are a way that Congress apportions responsibility for things and delegates responsibility. And so it needs to create a committee on this in order to not only apportion responsibility for dealing with it, but also so that these senators and members who might deal with it have the resources that they need in order to deal with it. So one of the things that I mentioned throughout this talk was the centrality of staff. And if you have a committee focused on something, then the first and most important thing, I think, is the staff. So you need to hire staff who are really expert in that issue, who can hold their own against lobbyists, and also help members to learn about this really technical and difficult topic. One of the things that we might also have noticed in the Zuckerberg hearings, which I mentioned just because they were, again, very theatrical, they might fall into that category of hearing if we were to categorize them, and we all saw them, we saw that a lot of the members didn't really quite know what to ask. They didn't maybe even know how social media works. And this is where having staffers with real knowledge of the issues can be instrumental in order to think about something as complex as tech. I also mentioned staff diversity, and especially with something like tech, where there are different and disproportionate effects on communities of color. You need staff who also have different lived experience of an issue, and you need diverse staff. And lastly, I might highlight that you need members who care about the issue and who have good relationships with each other. Of course, as I mentioned, that's another secret sauce. You need to have a chair and a ranking member who are not only in collegial terms with each other, but also care about that issue and want to be holding hearings that that can help illuminate different kinds of perspectives on the issue, because of course they hold the keys at the end of the day. They decide what kinds of hearings the committee will hold. And I would hope that that committee would hold a lot of field hearings and hold more hybrid hearings and be innovative in the way that it uses technology in its own work. So I think that there's a lot of space to think about, not just what new committees Congress could have hypothetically, but also innovative ways that they could work differently.
Well, and so this is my dream committee. I look forward to your chairmanship. But also then there's this question of how are members rewarded for doing that work? Because, you know, being on a workhorse committee and just putting your head down and working with the other side and getting things done is not always the easiest way to raise money or elevate your profile or, you know, get coverage. And, you know, maybe the hearing doesn't get picked up in the mainstream news if there's not some catchy soundbite where you've attacked the other side. So what would you say about our, you know, if you were to have a takeaway for the audience and for students in how we can be a part of helping these committees be more effective, and the media as well, what would be your recommendation for just kind of being supportive of the elevation of the work of committees?
So I think there's a number of things that folks can do. First of all, committee hearings are one of the major public forums that Congress has. They are public facing. They are opportunities that members of the public can attend hearings in instances like some of the work that the PopVox has been involved in. Members of the community can actually also give input in some of these sessions, either online or in person. There are instances, as I mentioned, of the Farm Bill Listening Tour, where folks can also come and share their experiences with the committee. But even if they're not involved in the hearing itself in these ways, they can, in many different ways, attend hearings. You can, just like any lobbyist does, write to members and suggest questions that they might ask in a hearing. You can write to the committee and suggest witnesses that they might call. Lobbyists do this all the time, and citizens can too. These are forums that are meant to engage with the public. And so the public also has an opportunity and really a responsibility to engage. And the other thing that I would say in terms of the public and the media, I was just at a conference recently where I think that someone said that Congress would score lower on a public opinion poll than cockroaches or something like that. Like it's even less like we don't have a lot of faith in Congress, and opinion poll after opinion poll shows that. And the media portrays Congress in a way that is also, of course, as I mentioned, tending towards what's most salacious and what's most broken. And I think that when there is just that kind of sentiment of nothing is working, let's give up, then there's not a lot of space to be thinking about how we can strengthen it. Getting involved in some of these exciting conversations happening now, like with the Select Committee on Modernization, and saying, okay, let's think with Congress about how it can do its job better. And let's tell it as citizens that we care for it to do its job better, and that matters to us, and that we want to be engaging with it. Then, you know, I think that in a way that gives confidence to the institution that it can and it should be thinking about ways that it can serve the public better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could not agree more. We should all be avid C-SPAN watchers. And let me see, I think there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to. So quickly, just to address the reason that congressional staff declined over the years, and how that is changing, and it is changing somewhat, how it might change in the future, this congressional brain drain, and also how you think we can get more diversity into congressional staff and into that pipeline of future policymakers and decision makers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both great questions. So one of the reasons that staff has decreased over the years is because of this power dynamic that I talked about of the speaker versus the committees. So well known, and I might even say infamous speakers like Newt Gingrich really cut committee staff. And one of the reasons that that might have been advantageous to him as a speaker is because that allowed him to maintain more of his power, because staff is power on committees. And so staff was cut. Key congressional support agencies either saw their staff decreased or were defunded. The what's known as the Office of Technology and Assessment, which was a major support agency that helped Congress understand complicated science and tech, was defunded in the 90s. Other key support agencies like the Congressional Research Service and the GAO also saw their staff numbers decline. And so this really is part of the story of the loss of committee power relative to party power. And it's part of that story in a somewhat deliberate way. And again, there is a change now. There have been a lot of moves recently as a result of the Select Committee on Modernization to create a centralized HR hub, to create an Office of Diversity and Inclusion that will not just recruit, but also retain diverse staff, a decoupling of staff pay from member pay in order to ensure that staff can be building careers in Congress. These are all recent changes that are really exciting. But in terms of how we can further improve staff diversity, well, I think that the Office of Diversity and Inclusion is a great start. They're doing wonderful work in collecting data on staff diversity and trying to recruit staff. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of not just recruiting these staff members, but also creating the networks and the kind of pipelines that can help them move up and really attain staff leadership positions, and really have the kind of training and the networks that they need in order to succeed in Congress. And it's a slow process, right, when there's a hiring pipeline and when folks have to move up through it. So it'll take time.
Well, and also I would say the provision in the most recent appropriations bill also called for the creation of an intern resource office along the lines of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So I think recognizing what you were saying, Maya, about the internships being kind of the on-ramp to this work, and how important it is both to have outreach to people from lots of different backgrounds, and also to make it an easier transition to come to the Hill, to get to acclimated while they're there, and to want to stay. Thank you so much. We've covered so much. I just want to again say the book is highly readable. It has so much excellent information that I have not seen ever presented the way that you did. As someone who, had a little bit of experience with committees, there were a lot of aha moments of like, of course that's how it works. How, finally somebody explained it. So I just want to congratulate you on really capturing, I think, a lot of the lived experience of people who do this work and demystifying it for people who would like to understand what the heck is going on in there and how to make it work better. So back to you, Maya, but just thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Greenlight. Thank you so much, Marci, for the wonderful conversation and for your kind words. And thank you to everyone who attended. And I look forward to further conversations or questions from anyone who's interested.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks so much for the fantastic reading, the discussion, the Q&A that was really active. I love to see an active Q&A box. It makes me really happy as a bookseller. Don't forget to buy your copy of Inside Congressional Committees by Dr. Kornberg in store or online. The link is in the chat. Thanks everyone so much for joining us, and have a good, wonderful rest of your night.
you, Greenlight.
Thanks, Greenlight. Thank you, everyone.